You have learned about engine failures at altitude. Now we will talk about the most critical time for the engine to fail. And that is while you are taking off, or even more critical, just after takeoff. If the engine failed during the takeoff roll and you're still on the runway, all you would need to do is, as the checklist says, put the throttle to idle to discontinue the takeoff. Then apply the brakes to try and stop on the runway. The rest of these checklist items are if you're going to run off the runway itself. Now, are you going to have time to get out the checklist, find the right page, and then do the checklist? No. That's why these first items are bold-faced memory items. But if you're going off the runway, you will need to know all of them. And here they are. Let's talk about them. Flaps up for better braking. Then secure the airplane. The mixture, ignition, and master switch should all be off. And folks, it's okay to run off the end of the runway if you have to. You can always replace the airplane. Now let's talk about the most critical time for an engine failure, and that is right after takeoff. The reason this is most critical is that you do not have a lot of altitude to try to get the engine started or to maneuver the airplane to a favorable landing site. And you already know the ABCs of engine failure. And in this situation, following this procedure is critically important. A, as you know, is for airspeed. Here, as before, the airspeed is 65 knots indicated airspeed if the flaps are up, and you see it right here, and 60 knots if the flaps are down. And since you are climbing when the engine quits, you will need to get the nose down immediately. Remember your attitude. But if you do nothing else, fly the airplane at the recommended glide speed. Now, B stood for best field. Your choices here will be very limited. You should find the best landing site somewhere in front of you, but no more than 60 degrees to either side of the nose. It may be a tough decision. Trees or buildings may be in the way. You could go between the trees, but maybe not the buildings. If you do go for the trees, try to let the wings absorb the hits by aiming the fuselage between the trunks and keeping the cabin and passengers as safe as possible. This is a true story. A friend of mine had to do an emergency landing in the state forest in Washington, and he used his wings to absorb the impact and walked away with barely a scratch. So it does work. And remember now, C is for cockpit checks. Use your flow procedure, and if the engine doesn't start, cut off the fuel and electrics to try to prevent a fire. And the last item is to land straight ahead. But now you're probably asking, hey, why don't I just turn around and land on the runway? Because unless you have a lot of altitude, you will not make it back to the runway in one piece. And let's examine why. In this figure, you just took off from the airport and you've climbed to about 300 feet AGL. Remember that number, 300 feet AGL. Okay, let's assume you made a tight turn to get back fast, say 45 degrees of bank. Well, this would give you a turn rate of about 12 degrees per second. So a turn of 180 degrees would take about 15 seconds, and then the additional turn of 10 degrees to get headed back to the runway would take about 1 second. Plus, let's say 4 seconds for reaction time for a total of 20 seconds. In this steep bank, your descent rate has increased to about 1,000 feet per minute. So that equates to 333 feet of altitude loss. But remember, we were only at 300 feet to start with. And if you made a shallower bank turn, you'd lose even more altitude because it would take a lot longer to get around. Now, what happened to your stalling speed in the steep bank? Well, you know that the stall speed increases as you increase your angle of bank. So let's look at Figure 5.3 from your Skyhawk Pilot's Information Manual and see just how much in this case. As you see here, the stalling speed goes from 44 knots indicated airspeed in level flight to 53 knots indicated airspeed in a 45-degree bank. So, if you pulled around the corner at 65 knots, you would be very close to the stalling speed. And if you see you're not going to make it and you pull just a little bit harder, you get a little slower and stall, the results could be disastrous. That's why the best choice is to land straight ahead like the checklist suggests. You know, a test pilot once said, the difference between a true professional and the other pilots is that during takeoff, many amateurs are surprised when something doesn't work. And the pro is equally surprised when it does work. So if you're prepared for the engine to fail, it probably won't.